and the discussions. I'm going to be presenting some kind of very tentative ideas. This is not based on anything I've written. I tried to put this together as a result of the invitation that I received. I haven't really thought about metaphysics of social ontology very much. So take this with a grain of salt. And I do think, some of the ideas have been preempted by some of the other talks that have been given. I apologize if some of this seems kind of half-baked and not fully worked out. So what I wanted to talk about is a contrast that I see between two projects in social metaphysics or social ontology that are not often clearly distinguished or identified as such. And the two that I have in mind, we might label respectively as folk social metaphysics, which is an inquiry into the social world as we experience it, an attempt, in other words, to understand the metaphysical basis of social categories that are deployed in everyday life. And on the other hand, what you might label metaphysics of social science, which is more of a naturalistic inquiry into the categories of the social sciences and an attempt to make sense of the metaphysical foundations of social science in particular. So some of the salient differences as I see them between these two different projects have to do with the subject matter on the one hand. So the objects, processes, and events that are under investigation in these two projects tend to be somewhat different, be somewhat distinguished. So folk social metaphysics deals with such entities as cocktail parties, taking a walk, painting a house, sports teams, book clubs, department meetings, and so on. Whereas the metaphysics of social science deals with such entities as inflation, civil war, money, refugee, industrialization, undocumented immigrant, which don't figure that prominently. Well, some of them do, but I would say even when they do, they are considered under a different guise in these two different projects. The methodology also tends to be different, as we've heard in some of the earlier talks. So folk social metaphysics relies mainly on reflection about the furniture of our daily lives, using the methods of conceptual analysis, and it makes quite a lot of use of intuition. Whereas the metaphysics of social science takes a close look at the ontology of the social sciences using a more naturalistic approach. So it drills down into some of the recent work in economics, sociology, but also maybe anthropology and epidemiology and social sciences, which are often neglected actually in this kind of work, but perhaps ought to be dealt with a bit more seriously. And the conclusions also tend to be different. For instance, to anticipate a bit what I'm going to be saying in a little while, folk social metaphysics tends to think that social kinds are transparent to us. We're conscious of the categories that feature in our everyday lives, and we explicitly articulate them, whereas the metaphysics of social science often traffics in categories that may not be apparent and may only have occurred to social scientists as a way of understanding and explaining what's going on in the social world. Now, having said that, let me sort of try and complicate this picture a little bit. It's perhaps not so stark as I've been trying to make out. Of course, the subject matters of folk social metaphysics and the metaphysics of social science aren't totally disjoint. I've already mentioned some things that might be relevant to both, but things like money and government, even things like refugee and undocumented immigrant, might feature in both of those kinds of investigations. So some of the objects, events, and processes are relevant to both. Gender, race, perhaps, are also quite prominent in both sorts of investigations. And here are some others. But it seems to me the emphases are different, and there are many entities that are not common to both enterprises. And even when the entities are common, as we'll see, or at least where the categories that used are the same, they might be investigated under a different guise or in a different, under a different sort of mode of presentation. we might actually be talking about different kinds, even when we use the same categories or the same labels. Yeah, they might be viewed from different perspectives or have different guises. So inflation in economic analysis is different from the way it is felt by the kind of felt quality of inflation and how we perceive it and how we conceive of it in our daily lives. School as an entity in our ordinary lives, how we think about schools, even how we individuate schools, the identity conditions of a school might be different as it pertains to our everyday existence, our everyday social interactions, and as it might be understood by a sociologist who is interested in the, function of urban schools or how urban schools have contributed to inequalities or something like that. So we might think of, in our everyday lives, we might think of the identity conditions of a school as being quite different than the way that a sociologist might think of it. Now, when it comes to the methodology, I've said that folk social metaphysics explores intuitions about the entities that populate our social surroundings. It's largely in a kind of an a priori enterprise. It involves a lot of conceptual analysis, but although there is some intuition mongering in FSM, it might also involve some systematic inquiry and may not be a purely a priori enterprise. The metaphysics of social science, I've said, adopts a naturalistic methodology, which is closely related to the philosophy of science. And you can think of it as an a posteriori inquiry informed by the results of the social sciences, by actual empirical investigations. But at the same time, it does involve some conceptual analysis and even conceptual engineering. We might be interested in more emulative projects, as we heard in some of the talks in the last couple of days. And so it may not be entirely different, or the methods may not be entirely disjoint from those of folk social metaphysics. When it comes to the conclusions, you might say that since the subject matters of folk social metaphysics and the metaphysics of social science mostly diverge, their conclusions might be fully compatible. They might be talking about different things, and therefore there may be no real tension or contradictions between them. But sometimes I think when the subject matters overlap, the different interests and methods may actually lead to different conclusions and even maybe contradictory conclusions. So for instance, philosophers in folk social metaphysics tend to be infallibilists about social kinds. To quote Searle, Searle thinks that X is of a social kind K, if and only if it's conceived as K. So in order that the concept money apply to the stuff in my pocket, Searle writes, it has to be the sort of thing that people think is money. Meanwhile, philosophers in the metaphysics of social science tend to be fallibilists about those same social kinds. So to quote Francesco Guala, belonging to a social kind is not a mere matter of conception or stipulation. Money is as money does. He quotes economists as saying, irrespective of what people believe it is. So even though there might be a sense that there's a bit of a live and let live relationship between FSM and MSS, there are some times when there do seem to be contradictions or tensions in what they say about the very same subject matter. Now, here again, one might, and I'll say a bit more about this in a bit, but one might try and make them compatible, render them compatible by saying they're really talking about different phenomena. They're using the same label money, but they're talking about it in a different guise and may even be identifying a different social kind. I'm not sure that that's a feasible thing to say here, but in some of these cases, that might be what's going on. So one objection you might have to this attempt to draw a kind of stark contrast between these two enterprises or these two modes of investigation or inquiries is to say that, look, as I've already hinted, folk social metaphysics isn't just an a priori enterprise. Why not think of it as a systematic empirical investigation of our everyday Lebenswelt, our everyday life world? You can think of folk social metaphysics as being a sort of compartment of the metaphysics of social science, namely one where you're doing a sort of ethnography of ordinary people, albeit ordinary weird people in the Heinrich sense of Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic people. So you're focusing on philosophers have tended in this tradition who've done what I would call folk social metaphysics to focus really on the life worlds of a small group of individuals in certain societies. But be that as it may, aren't they still doing a certain kind of empirical investigation of the social categories that figure in the worlds of those individuals? So you can think of folk social metaphysics as being almost a contribution to the foundations of anthropology, or the ontology of the folk, albeit weird folk, and hence maybe just a department of the metaphysics of social science. Now here, I mean, I think we should be a bit cautious, and one way to identify why this might be too neat a resolution and may not be really quite an accurate way of understanding the relationship between these two kinds of investigation is by distinguishing what some social scientists call the emic and etic perspectives on the social world. So the emic perspective is supposed to capture the attitude of social actors themselves, whereas the etic perspective captures the attitudes of inquirers or researchers. And one of the anthropologists who's done most to sort of popularize this distinction is Marvin Harris, in some work, which I think nowadays often people find dated, and many anthropologists, I think nowadays would say that they've transcended this kind of distinction or this way of looking at things, but I think it's still conceptually useful, and it might help to understand that these two perspectives or these two different kinds of investigation might not be easily reconciled, precisely because FSM might be capturing the emic perspective as opposed to the etic, which seems more the concern of the metaphysics of social science. So to try and kind of investigate this further, or to elaborate what's going on, or to understand how these two kinds of investigation might be related to each other, I wanted to take a very brief look at a case study that I find quite interesting and illuminating for the philosophy of social science, which is the category of pandemic. So one question that I think is interesting to address is whether a pandemic can be thought of as a social kind, or perhaps a biosocial kind. On the MSS approach, I guess the way that you would go about addressing this question is to ask, what do scientists such as epidemiology say about the features of pandemics? Is pandemic an explanatory concept in a science of epidemiology? Or indeed, do pandemics have a cluster of causal properties in common, which is a kind of view of kinds that I would tend to favor, to think of them as having to do with clusters of causal properties. So that would be the kind of MSS approach to understanding whether a pandemic is a social kind. On an FSM approach, you might wonder instead whether pandemics feature as abiding features of our social lives. Do they figure in our phenomenological experience of the world? Do they help understand and explain how we interact with the world from a sort of subjective point of view? Or related to that, can we use Searle's formula to characterize them? So Searle's project, I take it, is largely a project in folk social metaphysics. And as I'm sure everyone knows, he thinks this is sort of paradigm formula for understanding what social kinds there are, has to do with this idea of X counting as Y in context C. So is there a sense in which pandemics are amenable to being understood via this formula. So let me take these two kinds of investigations in turn and see what they turn up, or at least in a very preliminary and tentative way. So if we look at the recent epidemiological literature, there's some work that suggests that pandemics are epidemics that have the following features. They have wide geographic extension. They spread via transmission that can be traced from place to place. They have high attack rates, high rates of incidence among a population, and multiple cases appearing within a short time. They occur when there's minimal population immunity. They tend to be associated with novel variants of existing organisms or novel viruses, for instance. They tend to be very infectious. They're contagious from person to person, and they tend to be quite severe or involve fatal diseases. And this is a set of features from a widely cited paper, which is one of the actually few papers in epidemiology, as far as I can tell, that really try and kind of get to the bottom of how we should understand pandemics or what their main features are. And this is a paper by Morens, Folkers, and Fauci. Yes, the same Fauci from 2009. Now, as these authors themselves note, as in many others in the epidemiological literature have also pointed out, most of these features are very vague and ill-defined, and they don't seem to be causally integrated in the way that properties of kinds typically are. There doesn't seem to be a way in which these causal features go together as causal properties that where we can explain why these features cluster together because of causal relationships. The other glaring problem with this attempt to characterize pandemics is it's really parasitic on the characterization of epidemics. And as also many epidemiologists have pointed out, epidemic is not a very well-defined category and is not really used as an explanatory category, ironically enough, in epidemiology. So as a result, I think many researchers in epidemiology have concluded that pandemic is not an explanatory category and it doesn't capture a real feature of the world. In fact, Morens, Folkers, and Fauci say there seems to be only one invariable common denominator, and that's widespread geographic extension. And that in itself is very vague, and it seems very subjective as to how to characterize what is widespread. Does it have to, some people have tried to do it in terms of how many borders it crosses and so on, but that just seems really kind of not terribly well-defined and doesn't really capture an explanatory category. Now, this isn't to say that one couldn't come up with a causal model of pandemics that would show that these properties or some subset of them are causally related in such a way that they might tend to cluster together, albeit loosely. But it's, at least as I understand, in my very cursory reading of this literature, is that there doesn't seem to be a rough causal model of pandemics. And most working scientists in this area don't really regard pandemic as an explanatory category. So if that is the case, then as good naturalists, a proponent of the metaphysics of social science would have reason to conclude that pandemic is not a social kind and shouldn't be a part of our social ontology. Now that sounds maybe a little counterintuitive, and if we're taking a folk social metaphysics approach to pandemic, we might balk at that conclusion, because pandemics seem to play a large role in our experience of the world, and they shape our lives in important ways. We might say that, my experience of the world in the last couple of years has been very strongly shaped by the current or the ongoing or recently concluded, depending on your viewpoint, pandemic. Now, that by itself, of course, doesn't show that there is a kind pandemic which plays such a role, because if I say that, the pandemic explains why my move to New York was delayed by a year, or why my teenage kids were doing online school in the past couple of years, that just might be a way of referring to a singular event, namely the COVID-19 pandemic, and it might not carry any kind of commitment to a kind or an ontological category pandemic, which plays such a role. It might be that every pandemic is a unique event or process rather than a member of a social kind. And so the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic features in my experience of the world and in the way that I interact with others and with my environment and so on may just be a reference to that singular event. It might not entail a commitment to a social kind pandemic. But if we consider an influential approach to social metaphysics, namely Searle's, and think about how it might understand the identity conditions of pandemics, you might think that really what it is to be a pandemic is to be declared to be a pandemic. So, if you take a certain disease outbreak, it would count as a pandemic in some context of global health, provided the relevant authorities declare it as such, whether it's the World Health Organization or the Center for Disease Control in the US. Of course, organizations like that have a habit of making these kinds of declarations. And you might say really what it is to be a pandemic and what explains why pandemics play a certain kind of regular role in our lives is this declarative act, this speech act, whereby certain relevant authorities declare something to be a pandemic, much in the way that a magistrate declares a couple to be married, or someone declares a baby to be baptized or something like that. So does declaring something to be a pandemic in the right circumstances by the right authorities make it a pandemic? And it is the case that both the WHO and the CDC came up with definitions of pandemics. And this happened fairly recently in 2009 after the H1N1 outbreak that referred not just to the spread of a disease, but also to its severity in defining what a pandemic was. Now, some commentators have kind of remarked on the cynicism of this. One expert in public health writes, it's tempting to surmise that the complicated pandemic definitions used by the WHO and CDC involved severity in a deliberate attempt to garner political attention and financial support for pandemic preparedness. So the idea is that this declaration of pandemic was really done for political purposes. It wasn't so much to identify sort of an underlying condition or to point out that certain kinds of things were happening in the epidemiological realm, but rather to simply declare something for the purpose of garnering political attention and financial support. But be that as it may, we might fall back on the idea that a pandemic is just what the WHO or the CDC say it is. And the folk social kind pandemic just might be a matter of declaration by the relevant authorities, just as marriage, at least on some understandings, or baptism might just be a matter of what the magistrate says it is, or the religious official, or whoever it is, right? And this might be a vindication of Searle's approach to understanding social kinds in this way as being results of declarative speech acts. So would this create a homogeneous class of events or processes, and is that enough to establish pandemic as a social kind, at least from the perspective of FSM, as opposed to the perspective of MSS? Now, I think it might be a little too hasty to conclude that declaring something a pandemic just makes it a pandemic. And I don't think that's just because pandemic is a biosocial rather than a strictly social kind. It's also because I think in general, these kinds of speech acts aren't entirely constitutive of social kinds, even if we're taking perspective of folk social metaphysics as opposed to the perspective of metaphysics of social kind. I think at the very least, there needs to be certain kinds of social uptake to lead to a fairly homogeneous class of events that would do sort of explanatory work for us, even if we're not strictly adopting a naturalistic inquiry and we're more interested in our own sort of life world and our own perceptions of the social world. So I think this class of events might remain in the realm of relatively inert speech acts unless they interact with social processes that have real social effects. Now, does this mean that folk social metaphysics doesn't capture a genuine ontological reality unless it has causal efficacy in the social world? And in that case, does that mean that what we really should be doing is the metaphysics of social science as opposed to folk social metaphysics? I'm not sure that's entirely right. For one thing, I think that this rests on a fairly narrow understanding of folk social metaphysics. And I'm not sure that everyone would endorse Searle's formula, certainly not as exhausting what it is to be a social kind. Not all approaches to folk social metaphysics are speech act oriented, and even those that are may not think that speech acts are entirely constitutive of social kinds or of making things members of those social kinds. So to try and conclude, I really don't have a firm conclusion. I just want to throw up certain kinds of ideas or possibilities to think about how we should situate these two inquiries in relation to each other, or whether we should be aiming to sort of reconcile them or to merge them in certain ways. But one approach or conclusion might be that the pursuit of folk social metaphysics should at least be clearly distinguished from the metaphysics of social science. So we should flag which one of these two things we're doing. And we might even, when we're talking about a social category like pandemic, and this might be true of many social categories, it might be true of race and gender and the category mother that Catherine Jenkins briefly alluded to a little while ago. And we might say, look, I'm talking about pandemic in the guise of, from the perspective of the metaphysics of social science. I'm not talking about pandemic from the perspective of the metaphysics of folk social metaphysics. And we might flag this distinction explicitly when we're conducting our investigations. But I'm not so sure that we can have this kind of very neat and easy resolution, because as I've already suggested, I think these two categories interact, and I'm not sure that the kinds can be segregated in a very neat way. So, for example, once a pandemic is declared, certain social processes may ensue that can then be the subjects of social scientific inquiry, and it becomes a matter for investigation by the metaphysics of social science. So it seems to me that the two categories can't be very neatly kept apart in this case, and maybe in many other cases as well, although I think maybe this dialectic plays out differently for different social constructs. And I think there's often an ambiguity as to which aspect of a social construct we're investigating. So take something like war. I think it's been pointed out that almost all wars in the 20th century were not actually declared as such, or were declared as such much later on, much after they were already underway. And yet declared wars might play a somewhat different role in the political and social world than undeclared wars. Does something happen to a war once it becomes declared? Does it mobilize certain actors to try and seek a resolution of that war? It seems as though these things, there's a sort of complex interaction between what you might call the sort of opaque kinds and the transparent kinds, or the opaque aspect of a kind and the transparent aspect of a kind. But at the very least, it seems to me it's worth getting clearer on which type of inquiry we're pursuing and which aspect of a kind we're interested in investigating. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm looking forward to your reactions. As I say, this is very tentative, and I'm still trying to figure out these ideas. So I'd be grateful.
So thank you for this very challenging talk. We have already many questions. So I think Thomas was first.
Yeah, thanks. That was super interesting. So this depends a bit on who exactly should be counted under the label of folk social metaphysics, and I don't know. There might not be that many people who would like self-affiliate to this sort of camp. So it does describe. But I was interested in the claims about transparency and infallibility, because I can see that there is a certain kind of story to tell as to why those would be sort of central to this approach, if it is an approach that's sort of avowedly armchair and sort of even phenomenological in its approach, because then you might think, well, then these social kinds they study, that they had better be transparent, or you couldn't study them from the armchair or something like that. But so I guess there is a certain logic there, but in practice, I just don't think that is how it is in the literature. What I think rather has gone on is that certain early models in that tradition, definitely Searle, but also say Gilbert or something, those are theories which just seem to imply a certain amount of transparency, maybe infallibility. And so, yeah, people were prone to make such claims. But I think if you, in sort of, people nowadays working in broadly that sort of research program, they would think that insofar as a theory like Searle's implies transparency for social kinds or infallibility, then so much the worse for that theory, right? Most people think that this is a bug rather than a feature, I think, and one should be able to account for the sort of frequent non-transparency of these kinds of these kinds. And it's another question of whether they can successfully account for it, of course. But I do think people think that is the aim, and so they have that kind of in common with the metaphysics of social science, rather than it being a contrast, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, in some sense, I'm not doing sociology of the philosophy of social science. I'm sort of trying to define two rather sort of pristine ideals, which nobody really fits perhaps cleanly into either of those two categories. But on the point of sort of so much the worse for the theory if it doesn't account for the opacity of these social kinds. I mean, that was very much, I think, my thinking and the thinking of some others who wrote about or reacted to Searle's account and pressed this point that there's far more opacity in the social world than is dreamt of in Searle's philosophy. And I guess, though, I also think, as a kind of a sort of second thought, that it's interesting to think about the way in which opacity and transparency interact in the social world, and the way in which sometimes transparent social kinds are introduced in order to organize and institutionalize a pre-existing social world. And sometimes they're introduced out of whole cloth in order to sort of make an intervention into the social world. But then social actors and processes interact with that and of course they transform it. And, I mean, this happens a lot in, say, the legal realm, where you introduce a certain kind of legal category, and maybe it's organizing something that's been happening already, that in a very kind of inchoate and unrestricted way. And then by organizing it and by enforcing certain kinds of punishments, if certain rules are broken, then you transform the practice, and the practice evolves to try and invade some of those rules. Think about people trying to find tax loopholes and stuff like that, right? So I'm just sort of interested in this kind of dialectic that occurs between the transparent and the opaque, and the way in which these two things interact interestingly, so as to sort of go beyond the idea of saying, well, yes, the social world is not transparent to us in the way that some simplistic accounts might have thought. But having said that, in what ways is it transparent? In what ways is it opaque? And in what ways do these things kind of interact with each other?
Thanks. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Darine, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for a very interesting talk. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we can discern the influence of these two ways of thinking, even though it works out in a messy way. And I think we can explain a lot of things that are otherwise puzzling instances be just really different ways of approaching. Certainly in the philosophy of gender and race, what you were saying kind of really resonated. What I wanted to add, and I also really agreed, I was very much drawn to the suggestion you made at the end that we can't really fully disentangle these in practice. And so I want to suggest to you a place in the literature where maybe we see something that complicates that distinction in a way that I don't think raises a problem for anything you said. I just think it might be an interesting case to consider. So I was thinking of instances that you might think of as something like folk social metaphysics, or that maybe go towards that do deny the transparency of social kinds. They're not infallibilist, and they it seems to me tentatively that they seem to be ones often that have like a political impetus and are concerned about like the distorting effects of ideology. And I don't just mean people engaged in explicitly ameliorative projects, but kind of more broadly. I'm thinking of something like Catherine McKinnon's account of gender, or Charles Mills's account of race, both as this kind of the congealed effects of hierarchy. So there we seem to get something that's a perspective that maybe kind of seems to blur the emic and the etic. So it is trying to get away from the dominant attitudes of social actors, because it's thought that those attitudes are kind of influenced by ideology and are problematic and distorting, but it's not just kind of sticking there, it's then offering the account back to social actors. So maybe this is the attitude of like an inquirer or a researcher, and so it counts as etic, but it seems then like it would be a very engaged and situated inquirer or researcher who is also a social actor in the relevant context and is not cut off from other social actors. So yeah, I kind of wanted to offer you this kind of critical social ontology. I don't know, this I think you get the sense of the kinds of things I have in mind. I don't quite know how to label them, but I wondered where you thought those fit into the picture. They might be fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I think I take away from your question is that there are actually quite a few different dichotomies here, and maybe they're all false, right? So there's the FSM MSS dichotomy. There's the emic, the etic one. There's the opaque, the transparent one. And then there's the ideal, non-ideal one, to quote Åsa Berman's talk from yesterday. And they don't all quite coincide. They're all a little off kilter. I mean, there's a certain sense in which the transparent opaque cleaves a little closely to the folk social metaphysics versus metaphysics of social science, but not entirely, as you're bringing up. I mean, there's some people who are doing folk social metaphysics, but are also interested in those aspects of the social world that are not fully transparent to us, or that are masked for us by ideology, and therefore there's this sort of debunking thing going on, but they're still engaged in the kind of folk social metaphysics. And yeah, do we consider that emic or etic? I mean, maybe for this partly for this kind of reason, I think anthropologists have tended to move away from that. I find it a very good conceptual starting point to think about emic and etic, and I think it clarifies certain puzzles that arise in the philosophy of the social sciences, for me anyway. But I think practicing anthropologists have said, that's kind of old hat. These things, you know, I'm married to an anthropologist, so I have to be accountable to her in on some of these issues. And so, you know, so she says to me, no, that's kind of old hat because we're all aware of positionality now. And of course, you're the researcher, but you're also doing you know, your the methodology is just, I'm having a mental glitch right now, but you're doing participant observation. So anthropologists talk about doing participant observation. Is that emic or etic? It doesn't quite fit into these things. Now, I mean, the challenge, I think, is, I mean, as I said, these dichotomies, I find them useful as a starting point. And I think they're good to do some kind of philosophical ground clearing, but in some way we have to, I think, kick them away. And I'm just worried that if we do, what we're ending up with is a sort of mess that it's very hard to wade through in order to be able to do social ontology or philosophy of social science. So it's that kind of thing that I'm wary of. I understand the limitations of these distinctions, but I'm also worried about doing away with them entirely and then not being able to sort of navigate the idea, or not being able to navigate these different perspectives or something like that. So, but I'm very grateful for you bringing up the ways in which these things, you know, are messier than I might have made it sound.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Asia, you have a question?
Yeah, great, thanks. So I really like this distinction. I think it's really, really useful. So I want to ask about these cases where you said that both sides seem to be talking about the same kind, and yet you think that the views that they're giving might be compatible. So those struck me as kind of really interesting and important cases. And one thing that you said about these cases is that the two sides might be actually talking about different kinds. So say money and money star. I think that that's actually a really plausible proposal. I think that even in the case of money, we might say that someone like Searle is talking about legal tender, whereas someone like Guala is talking about, say, money proper. And kind of on this sort of pluralist picture, I think it's really clear how the views that they're offering might be compatible, namely they're talking about different things. But I think you said another thing, which is that in these cases, it might rather be that the two sides are talking about the same kind, but under different guises. And so I wasn't sure whether you wanted to say that in these cases too, the accounts that they're giving might be compatible. If so, I guess I was having a harder time understanding how they could be compatible. So if we think that metaphysics is generally in the business of kind of giving the true account of like nature, or I don't know, just the metaphysical account of some phenomenon, it seems like there's just going to be one correct account. And so if both sides are doing metaphysics, then how could it be that the correct account is somehow kind of, I mean, it would have to be relative to a guise or something. And so I was curious whether you wanted to go that route, or whether you wanted to say that, well, in those cases, if they're talking about the same kinds, but under different guises, then one of them just has to be wrong. Or one of them is not like really engaged in the project of metaphysics, even though we've kind of labeled it as a kind of metaphysics.
I think what I would hope to say, and I mean, I can't hope to sort of try and corroborate that right now, but what I would hope to say, which is something that I try to say in other contexts, is that they're all trying to glom on to certain causal structures, but those causal structures are maybe slightly different. So I mentioned in response to Catherine's talk earlier, there are people who are realists and yet pluralists about biological species. So you might say, well, there's phylogenetic species, and then there are ecological species. And those two things, the extensions of those often coincide, but sometimes they end up individuating things a little differently, or seeing two species rather than one, where, according to one way of identifying the kinds. And they're both right, because what one of them is interested in is, historical diachronic relationships, and the other is interested more in synchronic relationships and, current populations. And so, even though they're using the same category species, we might want to talk about species and species star and say, well, on one way of individuating species, which looks at a certain set of real causal features in the world, these are two distinct species. On a different way, which looks at a different set of causal features, they're really only one species. So can we make good on that for the social world, or are there going to be cases, like the case of money or the case of gender or whatever, where that's what's going on? My hunch is yes, but I think it's a bit more complicated in the social world. I mean, I tend to see certain continuities between the natural domains and social domains, and indeed, interactions. I mean, epidemiology is a kind of an interesting case. But I do think that in many of these cases in the social world, because of representation, because of awareness, because of reflexivity, you get complications that you don't always get in other domains.
Yeah, I mean, that all seems really plausible to me, but I guess I would still press the point that it seems like in this case, they're actually talking about two different kinds. It just so happens that the two different kinds have the same extension, but they're these distinct kind species. It's not as if they're talking about the same kind under different guises.
No. So I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. They might have different extensions too, though. I mean, it might be that on Guala's account, if prisoners in prison are using cigarettes as a medium of exchange, that's money. And Searle would say, no, unless the Bureau of Engraving and Printing has declared it to be money, it's not money. I'm sorry, and I wouldn't want to say, the Searle way of thinking is not germane to the social sciences, or no economist would be interested in that. I think some economists would be interested in that and would say, no, according to our way of thinking, or the kinds of things that we want to explain, or why people are not doing certain things with this commodity, I mean, there might be certain purposes for which even an economist would want to go that way. I guess that's all I want to say.
Asa, you have a question?
Yes, thank you for your very interesting talk. I have a lot of question and ideas, but I'll put it in one. So I was thinking about the distinction you made between the two main categories. So you had subject matter, method, and conclusion. And I was thinking maybe there is another feature that is more prominent than subject matter. So I was thinking about Daniel's talk before with the iterative process. So it seems to me that a lot of social science also explains change over time, and revolutions and changes in institutions and these things, while much of what you call the folk social ontologists sort of take a snapshot of society and look at that. So I was thinking a little bit about perhaps also change versus non-change is part of one of the differences. And then it also seemed to me that the subject matter thing might just be due to a subset of the domain. So Saul, Gilbert, Tumala sort of all started from the same sociologists, Durkheim and Weber and Simmel, and that's how you got to that list of social group that is the first person perspective social group. But if they would have started with Karl Marx instead, they would have gotten to groups and structures that are opaque in a sense. So so that was that's it.
Yeah. I mean, on the issue of change, I haven't really thought about that, but I'm not sure that folk social metaphysics or folk social ontology is necessarily less interested in change or development over time. I mean, the way in which we interact with the social world, the way in which that evolves over time, is something that I think is important to our phenomenological experience of the social world. And it might just be a sort of accident that they've looked at snapshots, as you say, rather than an evolving dynamic social reality. And it might just be sort of for the sake of simplicity. I mean, their toy examples might have been such that, you know, taking into account the temporal dimension might have really complicated matters and, you know, not enabled them to make the sort of fairly simple, neat points that they wanted to make. Yeah, as for the other point, that's a really interesting point, and I actually don't know enough about the way in which. I mean, that's something I'd have to really think about. I think you may be right that, you know, even though some of the contributions to what you might consider folk social metaphysics seem like they were sort of a prioristic and not grounded in empirical work. They were grounded in empirical work. It was just a different set of sociologists or social scientists or social theorists than the ones that, or that might have pointed them in a certain direction. So Simmel as opposed to Marx, I think that's a very interesting kind of contrast. But that's I think that's an important point, and I think it does undermine a little bit thinking about these early contributors as being entirely in the sort of folk social metaphysics camp, as opposed to metaphysics of social science camp, albeit a social science of a certain sort.
Alexis has a question.
Yes, hi. So in comparison and critique, you said that declaring something a pandemic doesn't make it a pandemic. Can't we say that it creates something in the social world which is like a pandemic state, a social pandemic state, even though it fails to capture the reality of pandemic, if there's any, like a rumor or fake news? And second, you said that declarations alone don't make a social kind, but can't we say that it generates an individual or subjective social kind or social artifact at least? Yes, that's it.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I mean, I think I sort of made that point as a kind of an initial salvo, and then kind of went on to qualify it. But you're absolutely right that sometimes those kinds of speech acts do something in the social world. But I guess what I was trying to say is that, you know, and you know, maybe this is a caricature of Searle's position, but he sometimes writes as though that alone is enough to create a social reality. But of course, you know, even you know, if someone declares a couple to be married, and then somehow that declaration is never acted upon or followed through, there's a sense in which it's just a sort of an empty declaration. So I guess there needs to be a bit more attention paid to the notion of uptake, which some speech act theorists do pay close attention to. but often it's uptake in a very kind of limited sense. And it seems to me for something social to happen, for something genuinely social, as opposed to something maybe just psychological, there needs to be a lot more in terms of follow through and uptake of these speech acts. And that's often not emphasized enough. So I do think that when the WHO or the CDC declares a pandemic, yeah, certain things happen, quarantines happen, lockdowns happen, visa restrictions happen, and so on. But that all happens as a result. It's not just the, to put it in Speech Act terms, it's not just the perlocutionary force. There's got to be a whole set of processes that are unleashed as a result of it or in reaction to that kind of declaration. And I guess that's what is often underemphasized in some inquiries into folk social metaphysics, which really puts a lot of emphasis on the psychological and doesn't talk enough about, you know, the effects that have to occur as a result of these kinds of speech acts for them to acquire a genuinely social dimension and a social impact.
So, Brian, I don't know if you want to still raise your question. Or...
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks. So I thought this was interesting, and some of my questions are kind of along the lines of what people have been asking so far. I guess that I think I share with a number of the questioners kind of the worry about the Searlean paradigm for understanding kind of what's going on in kind of recent social ontology. And I thought that the pandemic example was a very interesting one, and it just struck me as likely that there might just be two different social kinds at work. One of them maybe you could label an epidemiological kind and one a sociological kind. So that wouldn't necessarily indicate that there's a contrast. It's just that there are two kinds for, I guess, what you're calling the MSS style analysis or approach. When we're talking about the sociological kind, it's one where there are presumably systematic consequences of the fact that I don't think that it's just that we use the word pandemic, but there's kind of a variety of social, psychological, physical, medical repercussions for for how we treat pandemics. And in as much, it may be that it's by no means enough for us to label it, or even for us to know that we've labeled, for everyone to know that we've labeled it. But if there's a systematic cascade of causal effects, then that seems to me to be, good reason for at least prima facie thinking that there's as real a social kind as there is an epidemiological kind. So I just wonder if you could essentially collapse the good work in FSM into a kind of MSS-like inquiry.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was suggesting as one possibility. I'm not sure what you mean by collapse, but one interesting complication which has come up is that I don't think they can be on entirely parallel tracks, and I'm not sure we can just talk about these two different kinds, pandemic and pandemic star, precisely because, as you said, once you declare a pandemic, once certain kinds of social and political restrictions ensue from that, then that has an interaction with what's going on at the more epidemiological or biological level, right? Because you close borders, then the virus is restricted in certain ways, or you make funds available for vaccines, and then the virus evolves and comes up with variants that are resistant to those vaccines. So if we wanted a sort of neat resolution where, FSM deals with pandemic and MSS deals with pandemic star, that's not going to be as easy to effect, precisely because pandemic and pandemic star are not on entirely parallel tracks. And that, I think, is different from, say, the biological case, where you say, well, I'm investing phylogenetic species, well, I'm investing ecological species. Well, there isn't the same kind of interaction that's going on between those two things that there is in the case of the sort of what you're calling the sociological kind and the epidemiological kind. So what I find really interesting is how that whole thing unfolds and how it complicates our attempts to do social science, but also to do the philosophy of social science.
I mean, I guess I just wonder, to add to that, you might think that there, if you're talking about kind of racial kinds, that there's a kind of government classification of race that's a kind of systematic. I mean, that'll have the same phenomenon that you're talking about here, where you have these very strong kinds of reciprocal causal interactions. But just because you have the causal interactions between the governmental, race kind and the, and some other racialized kind, those are going to have kind of mutual, very powerful causal forces. Doesn't necessarily mean that they shouldn't be ontologically distinguished, right?
Yeah, it's just that we might have to revise our ontological distinctions, because we're going to find that there are effects with race. It's not as immediate, perhaps, because it sometimes might take generations. But with a pandemic, I mean, there are these real-time effects of how the pandemic is unfolding, or whether it actually does cross geographic boundaries. Suppose we define it in an epidemiological sense as a disease that crosses geographic boundaries, but suppose that when we declare there to be a pandemic, we stop it from crossing those boundaries because of quarantines or lockdowns or whatever, or visa restrictions. And then we find, oh, wait, it's not doing the boundary crossing thing anymore, so it's not what we thought it was. So I just think that that's a kind of a that complicates the attempt to kind of make this neat ontological distinction.
So thank you very much, Muhammad Ali, and all the questions. And more generally, so thank you everyone for your talks and for your questions and the energy and all the ideas. So I think there's much to take out of this, and so I'm very grateful to all of you, and hope to see you soon in the real life.
And thank you for organizing it, and everyone for being here.
Thank you, Raphael. It was great. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. See you soon.
Thank
Bye,
you.
all.
Bye.